Since I was a child, I learned that everything in life needed a proper name. Good, evil, what pleases God and what distances Him. People were defined by their titles: pastor, believer, sinner, lost, saved. And me, well, I was labeled before. I even learned to think for myself. I was the pastor's daughter, the exemplary girl, the young woman of impeccable behavior. I grew up hearing this was a privilege, that carrying this name was a gift. But inside, I never felt worthy. Not because I did anything wrong, but because I felt every day the invisible weight of being what was expected, not what I truly was. I spent my life between church pews, Bible pages, whispered prayers, and long dresses that covered more than just my body. And even when I smiled, there was an ancient silence within me, a hunger for something I didn't know how to name. I never rebelled, never shouted, I simply obeyed. It was easier to be what everyone loved than to risk being what they might reject. That's why his gaze hit me like a silent earthquake, the kind of tremor only someone who's lived quietly for too long can feel. He arrived unannounced, without a surname, without a past. A man who didn't seem to seek anything, who didn't explain himself, who simply existed in the town as if passing through. And yet his presence didn't go unnoticed. People whispered. They said he slept little, walked a lot, never looked anyone in the eye. But when he looked at me for the first time, there was something there, a mute recognition, a crack between two worlds that until that moment I thought would never touch. And as much as everything in me screamed that it was wrong, reckless, dangerous, a hidden part of my heart whispered, someone finally saw me, not as the pastor's daughter, not as a symbol, not as an example, but as a woman. Our connection wasn't built on words. It was built on silences. Silences that didn't embarrass, but embraced. I saw him on the streets, always alone, carrying books without titles or staring at the ground, as if it held answers the world couldn't give. No one knew exactly where he came from or what he did beyond the odd jobs he took for a few coins. He spoke little, answered only what was necessary, and when asked his name, he deflected with politeness and a half-smile that said everything and nothing at once. My father considered him a risk. Men without a past, Kathia, almost always, hide something. I pretended to agree, but inside, I wondered if it wasn't the overly visible pasts of others that had always suffocated me. And it was on one of those seemingly ordinary days, a stifling afternoon like so many others, that our paths truly crossed. I was leaving the church library, arms full of books, when he, coming from the opposite direction, offered help without hesitation, as if he'd already decided he would. I accepted, knowing anyone who saw us would talk. We walked side by side to the sidewalk. We didn't exchange more than 3 full sentences. But it was the way he looked at me when we parted, a look without haste, without judgment, without any intent beyond presence, that stayed with me for the rest of the day. And when I lay down that night, my mind spinning between the afternoon's readings and the sound of my father's steady breathing in the next room, I caught myself whispering to the ceiling, why does someone without a name make me feel so alive when everything with a name in my life holds me back? In the days that followed, I started looking for him without admitting it. My eyes sought him in the market, on the park benches, at the corners he often passed. It wasn't desire, not romance, not yet. It was a new kind of restlessness. Something in me began to wonder what lay beyond duty, reputation, the role I'd always played. I started noticing questions inside me I'd never dared voice aloud, like, what if I don't want this destiny? What if my faith isn't exactly like my father's? What if behind the exemplary life everyone applauds, there's a woman wanting more than just to please? It wasn't rebellion, it was discovery. And that discovery had dark eyes, quiet steps, and no known story, just the promise that there was a world beyond the bubble I'd grown up in. A world where maybe, finally, I could be me. It was after our third encounter, if I can call it that I realized something in me had crossed an invisible line. He was sitting on the steps of the Old Town School, reading a worn, coverless book, and I, without any real reason, changed my route just to pass by. He looked up the exact moment I approached and said nothing. But the way his eyes held mine, without urgency, without intent to flee, was enough to stop me. I sat beside him without asking permission, and he simply closed the book and smiled. We talked about small things, the heat, the birds, how the summers here were always the same. And yet, every sentence we exchanged seemed to carry double meaning. He never asked anything directly about me, never pressed. But his questions came in the pauses, in the way he listened with his whole body, in how he let me speak without fear. And for the first time, I heard myself too. I heard my contradictions, my desires, my small courages trying to rise within the perfect frame that had always surrounded me. That same night at dinner, my father remarked that certain wandering figures were getting too close to decent people. He didn't say my name, but his eyes pinned me with the firmness of someone erecting a fence before the cattle could stray. My stomach churned. It was a warning, an invisible wall, a reminder of who I was supposed to be. But for the first time, that old rhetoric didn't bring me peace. It brought anger, a quiet, contained but stubborn anger. I went to my room early, didn't ask for a blessing, didn't recite the daily verse, and I lay down with my heart pounding, not from fear of reprimand, but from the sense that something was about to happen, something I couldn't undo. The following Sunday, he entered the church. Silent as always, he sat in the back, causing no stir. But his presence was a muted thunder in the middle of the liturgy. Heads turned, whispers began. My father's sermon grew sharper, mentioning the danger of wolves disguised as sheep. And I, sitting in the front row, eyes fixed on the Bible pages, felt my blood boil in a way it never had before. For the first time, the altar seemed too small for so much hypocrisy. For the first time, my faith felt at odds with my conscience. And when the final prayer ended, I stood before anyone else. I turned, met his eyes across the distance, and walked toward him. People followed me with their gazes. My mother murmured. My name and my father, for the first time in his life, called out to me loudly inside the church. I didn't stop. And in that exact moment, between the altar and the door, I ceased to be just the pastor's daughter and began at last to be Kathia. The town reacted as I expected, with silence masked as courtesy and judgments dressed in pity. The women from church greeted me without meeting my eyes, as if I carried a contagious guilt. The men, even those closest to my father, looked at me as if trying to figure out where my upbringing had gone wrong. At home, the air was even heavier. My father hadn't spoken to me since that Sunday. The prayers before meals grew longer, as if he were trying to purify the air, expel something that now lived there, and that something, deep down, was me. My mother looked at me with restrained sadness, but her eyes also held fear, not of me, but of what my actions might mean for us all. I understood that fear. For a long time, I lived under it. But now, there was a voice in me that wouldn't be silenced. It didn't shout, didn't accuse, just said, "Keep going." In the days that followed, I kept seeing the man without a name. Sometimes we exchanged few words. Other times we walked for long minutes side by side in silence. He told me he'd grown up far from here, that he'd learned early to survive, where no one gives you a name or a place. He said he'd made mistakes, but had also learned not to hide from them. And even when he didn't speak directly, there was a disarming transparency in his presence, something I'd never experienced with the men from church, who preached righteousness but hid their own missteps beneath well-chosen words. With him, Everything was simple. If it hurt, he said so. If he didn't know, he admitted it. If he feared, he didn't disguise it. And that's exactly what drew me in. The fact that he didn't pretend to be more than he was. Slowly, I began to see the world through new eyes. The town stopped being a temple and became a fence. The words I'd always recited as truths started to sound like lines memorized by someone who no longer felt them. And within me, a new kind of faith began to grow, not one built on tradition, but on experience. I started praying differently. I started listening to myself with the same attention I'd always given to others' voices. And beside him, I realized I didn't have to renounce my essence to live something true. I could keep believing. But now, believing with freedom, with awareness, believing with an open heart, not closed eyes. He never asked me to choose, never pitted me against my family, my church, my history. But with his mere existence, he showed me that sometimes the choice isn't between one path or another. It's about finally allowing yourself to walk on your own feet. The revelation didn't come as a dramatic confession or a public scandal. It was a simple conversation at the end of an afternoon when the wind blew hard and the sky seemed heavy with omens. We were sitting on an old bench near the abandoned train station, one of the few places in town where time seemed to have stopped. He told me without preamble that he'd spent part of his life running, not from the law, but from himself. He'd gotten involved with the wrong people, trusted where he shouldn't have, made decisions that cost him dearly, including his freedom for a time. Yes, he'd been in prison, not for violence, but for taking the fall for something he couldn't prove he didn't do. It was easier to bear the burden than to prove my innocence to a world that had already decided who I was, he said, staring at the horizon as if speaking to the past. That hit me hard, not because of the revelation itself, but because, for the first time, I understood the silence he carried. It was the silence of someone who'd been stripped of everything, even their own story, and had to rebuild their identity piece by piece. I felt a pang in my chest, but it wasn't fear. It was a compassion so deep it almost hurt. He didn't apologize, didn't try to justify himself. He just offered the truth, raw and clean, like someone handing over a still bleeding wound and saying, "Here it is. Do you still want to stay?" I went home that night in pieces. Not because I doubted him, but because I knew what it meant. His name, or rather the absence of it, now had a story the town would never forgive. And I'd have to choose between remaining the pastor's daughter or being the woman who saw in that man more truth than in all the rules I'd been taught. I cried alone in my room, not out of weakness, but because I understood the cost of freedom. Freedom isn't light. It's a choice that burns inside. And I knew that by embracing this love, I'd face more than looks and whispers. I'd face the weight of disappointing those who always believed I was an extension of the altar. But when I closed my eyes, all I could remember was the way he held my wrist as he spoke, with gentleness, with a respect that was never demanded, only offered. And there, in the dark of my room, as I heard my father praying loudly next door, I knew the world they'd built for me no longer fit, and his name, whatever it was now part of my story too. I didn't wait for the right moment. I didn't rehearse words or seek permission. I just sat at the breakfast table, looked into my father's eyes and said, "I love him." His cup froze halfway to his mouth. My mother stilled, butter still on her knife. The silence was so thick it seemed to have a body. My father looked at me as if I'd just betrayed not only him, but God, the community, and everything that held us together as a family. "You're confused," he said, his voice low but laced with controlled fury. "He's a liar, a man with a dirty past, and you are my daughter." That's when I realized that to him, my identity had always been tied to that. Daughter, never woman, never free, never my own. Just a reflection of his faith, his reputation, the role assigned to me since birth. But I didn't back down. My voice shook, yes. My eyes filled with tears, yes. But I continued. He told me everything. He hid nothing, and still, I choose him. My mother lowered her eyes, not in agreement, but because she knew this was final. I wasn't asking for understanding anymore. I was stating my decision. At that night's service, I went alone. My father took the pulpit, and for the first time, his sermon felt empty. He spoke of obedience, purity, the duty to protect the flock. But there was a crack in his voice. Maybe he knew he'd already lost me. Maybe he was trying to reclaim authority before others. Now that he no longer had it over me, I sat in the back. No one spoke to me, but many looked, and for the first time I didn't shrink, because the shame they felt toward me was, in truth, their fear that others might awaken too, that other daughters might look at themselves and say, I'm not just this. Outside he was waiting, the man without a name, standing leaning against the fence, as always silent, as always present. I walked to him with steady steps. People saw us. My feet didn't falter. He didn't smile, just made space for me to stand beside him. And in that simple gesture, we sealed something that needed no declaration. I had chosen my path, and he, with all his scars, with all his mystery, was part of it. The days that followed were strangely calm. There were no grand confrontations or immediate reconciliations. The town did what it always did best, stayed silent where it couldn't control. Some doors closed, invitations stopped coming, and polite smiles were replaced by discreet absences. But I didn't feel loss. I felt relief. It was as if, by stepping out of the place they'd built for me, I finally had room to breathe with my own lungs. Freedom, I realized, doesn't arrive with fanfare. It comes quietly when you stop apologizing for being whole. We lived modestly, but with dignity. The man who now had a name, or at least the one he gave me when we first sat on our small porch, was Samuel. A simple, strong name he no longer needed to hide. We didn't seek acceptance or redemption in others' eyes. We just lived, day by day, without promising eternity, but offering presence. Samuel was unlike anything I'd known. He didn't expect me to serve or mold myself to him. He listened, shared, walked beside me. Sometimes he looked at me as if still wondering how we'd found each other. Sometimes he touched me like he feared time might take what was too hard won. And I understood, because I too carried scars that only freedom can heal. Our home was small, simple, built from the remnants of our past lives. There was no luxury, but there was peace. And there, far from the echo of voices that always told me who I should be, I began to discover who I truly was. I rediscovered my faith, not the old one of dogmas and fear, but a gentle faith that fit in the act of offering fresh bread to another, sitting by the window to watch the sunset, giving thanks for still being alive after so long silenced. With Samuel, I didn't have to choose between love and my soul. For the first time, they walked together. Months later, I received news. My father had fallen ill. Not urgent or fatal, but enough to bend his pride and bring fragility to light. The news came through my mother, who called with a hesitant voice, almost apologizing for breaking the silence they'd imposed since I left. She said he wasn't well, wasn't eating properly, was sleeping little. She didn't ask me to visit, but left the sentence hanging like a poorly stitched plea. He still prays for you, every night. Samuel looked at me when I hung up, as if he understood, without needing to ask. You need to go, he said, and I knew I did. Not out of duty or loyalty to the daughter I was, but because I was someone else now, and this new woman didn't carry grudges like medals. I went with an open but guarded heart. I knew we wouldn't find redemption in one conversation or an explicit apology. Men like my father rarely bend, but maybe time had taught him, as it had me, that loving doesn't always come the right way, and sometimes the most important thing is to stay. I found him seated in his old armchair, thinner, wearier, with sunken eyes and an open Bible on his lap. When he saw me, his expression split between surprise and a relief he tried to hide. We didn't hug right away. We just looked at each other for a long time. Then he spoke without preamble. "You look more alive." It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation. I smiled softly. "Because I am," I replied. He nodded, lowered his eyes, and said almost in a whisper, "I was wrong to think your path had to be mine." It was the closest to forgiveness that man would ever offer. And it was enough. We sat together for a few minutes, talked about the weather, the garden, the church now led by another. And when I stood to leave, he held my hand firmly. "Samuel, does he respect you?" The question came without bitterness, without sarcasm. Just a remnant of a father who still wanted to know his daughter was safe. "He sees me," I answered, "whole." And my father let go of my hand slowly, as if finally releasing what was never his to hold. I returned home with a light heart, not because the past had been fixed, but because I no longer lived bound to it. Samuel greeted me with that quiet smile, and for the first time since leaving the house where I grew up, I felt nothing was missing. Not explanations, not approvals, just the peace of having chosen truce and being chosen back. Today, as I walk the streets of the same town where it all began, I see that nothing has changed, and yet everything is different. The windows still creak in the wind. The church bells still ring on Sundays. And the same eyes that once judged me now simply look away, too tired to keep upholding the walls of what they don't understand. But me? I'm someone else. Not because I abandoned who I was, but because for the first time, I chose to be whole. My name is still Kathia. I'm still a pastor's daughter, but now I'm also a woman. I'm the partner of a man who loved me without shaping me. I'm the keeper of a faith that doesn't fit in dogmas but lives in actions, in caring for those I love, in waking early to make coffee and watch Samuel read in silence, with the serene eyes of someone who's finally found a place in the world. The story that bound us was never about scandal. It was about courage, about looking at everything they called sacred and asking, what if holiness lies in living with truth? Loving Samuel cost me many things, name, status, applause, but it gave me everything that matters, a life where I can breathe deeply, laugh without guilt, pray with freedom, and lie down at the end of the day knowing I was faithful, not to a role, but to myself. If anyone asks who he was, I'll say, he was the man who arrived without a name and, even so, gave me back my own. And that is everything.